Welcome back. In part two of this video series, we focus on the distinction between empirical and theoretical arguments. Among the topics covered here, 1. I provide a formal definition of argument. 2. I provide an example of a published research study. We'll walk through the study from empirical findings to theoretical framework to argument. 4. I talk about the difference between an empirical argument and a theoretical argument. 5. In the next slide, I talk about moving from empirical findings to the task of interpreting those findings. Let's go. Let's think about the task of interpretation, first behind the scenes, and second when writing your manuscript. Ultimately, the task of the social scientist is not simply to identify empirical findings, whether to point to conformity to social structure or to moments of resistance and agency. Behind the scenes, the task is to interpret those empirical findings using concepts, constructs, theories, and your own intellectual insight. Now comes the performance, the writing of your manuscript. Now you are speaking to the academic world. Through the written word, you must also be convincing. Just like a prosecutor in a courtroom must persuade a jury that their interpretation of evidence is valid and compelling, scholars must persuade readers that their interpretation is valid. Rhetoric matters, persuasion matters, clear reasoning matters. In your manuscript, you are making the case that your interpretation best explains what your evidence reveals. And that interpretation, grounded in evidence, theory, and insight, becomes your argument. Let me say that again because it's central to this entire tutorial. Your interpretation of empirical evidence, guided by theory and sharpened by your own insight, becomes your argument. That is why in this tutorial, I talk about learning to use theory and a theoretical framework to interpret your findings, and then to use that framework and argument to drive your manuscript. In other words, your theoretical framework and argument become the steering wheel of your writing. This is why I strongly advocate for what I call an argument-driven manuscript. Your readers should know what you are arguing before they arrive at your analysis section. We'll begin the strategy and format at different points in this tutorial. Finally, for many social scientists, convincing the academic community is not enough. There's also a desire to share knowledge with people who want to better understand institutions, navigate them more effectively, and even change them. Now let's pause for a moment and define the concept of argument. Let's define it more broadly. Across philosophy, the courtroom, the sciences, and nonfiction writing, argument has a remarkably similar core meaning. Here's my definition. An argument is a claim made to an audience, supported by evidence, and interpreted in such a way that the audience is persuaded that the claim carries meaningful validity. Which means if you do not have evidence to support your claim, you may have an opinion. It may be a reasonable opinion, but you do not yet have an argument. Over the years, while reviewing journal submissions, I noticed that many authors use the phrase, I argue, very casually. Often what they really meant was, in my opinion, this issue should be addressed differently. And here's why. That is not an argument. So what does I argue actually mean? in sociological writing. It means, quote, based on systematic evidence and theoretical reasoning, I am advancing a defensible interpretation of the data that explains a complex social phenomena, end quote. When sociologists write, I argue, they are signaling that they are making a claim about the social world, grounding that claim in empirical evidence, justifying that claim through theoretical reasoning, and entering into scholarly debate. In short, when sociologists say, I argue, they are inviting scrutiny. And that's exactly what serious scholarship requires.